I've been married a few times, and it doesn't really change who you are at the core. You learn, you adapt, but you're still the same person inside. I've been thinking about Robyn a lot lately. She's one of the kindest people I know, and I'm just so grateful to have her in my life.
Kody Brown didn't lose his marriages because of incompatibility. He lost them because he miscalculated power. And the most dangerous part? He still thinks this is about emotions. It's not. It's about leverage. And if you don't understand that, you're missing what's actually happening right now inside the collapsing ecosystem of sister wives. The narrative being sold publicly is simple. The family fell apart, feelings were hurt, people grew apart. That explanation is comfortable. It's also strategically incomplete. Because when you strip away the tears and confessionals, what remains is a financial chessboard, and one piece just moved in a way that Kody and Robyn cannot easily counter. Janelle isn't just remarried. She may have repositioned herself economically, and if that's true, this isn't romance. It's regime change. You've watched this show long enough to recognize patterns. Kody's authority was never rooted in emotional intelligence. It was rooted in perceived provision. Control the land, control the housing, control the contracts, control the access to TLC. That's the spine of patriarchal power. And for years, that spine looked stable enough to intimidate dissent. But here's the quiet fracture. When Christine left, viewers celebrated emotionally. When Janelle left, viewers recalibrated strategically. Christine's exit wounded Kody's ego. Janelle's exit threatened his structure. Because Janelle understood the numbers. She wasn't the romantic idealist. She was the logistical realist, the budget mind, the one who spoke in spreadsheets instead of size. When she challenged property allocations at Coyote Pass, it wasn't about jealousy. It was about asset division. And you saw how uncomfortable that made Kody, not because he didn't love her, because she was auditing him. Now imagine that woman, the one who already questioned land distribution, aligning herself with a man whose financial profile reportedly exceeds Kody's. Even if we remove exaggeration and strip this down to possibility, the symbolism alone destabilizes everything. Kody's identity has always been performative prosperity, the big house vision, the grand patriarch energy, the narrative that he built something vast. But building something vast on television is not the same as building something sustainable, off camera. Let's look at the evidence without dramatics. Multiple wives left. That means multiple income streams fragmented, real estate markets fluctuated, the Coyote Pass development stalled. The large home tied to Robyn carried significant overhead. Legal divorces happened. Emotional fallout turned into contract renegotiations. That's not gossip. That's structural strain. Now layer this on top. Janelle potentially entering a partnership where she no longer needs TLC for stability. Do you understand what that means? It means she can negotiate from detachment. And detachment is the most threatening posture in reality, television. Because the show only works if someone needs it. If Janelle doesn't need it, financially or emotionally, she becomes unpredictable. She can walk. She can demand. She can expose. And exposure is the one thing Kody has always tried to control. Notice something subtle over the past seasons. Whenever financial specifics came up, who paid for what, who contributed to which property, the conversation either escalated into defensiveness or got redirected. That's not accidental. Financial transparency shifts power dynamics quickly. You don't panic when you're secure. You panic when scrutiny reveals imbalance. Robyn's positioning here is equally telling. Historically, when she felt stable in Kody's favor, she projected calm superiority. Lately, her tone has carried something else, a defensive fragility, as if she senses the axis shifting. Because here's the part people don't want to admit. Robyn's security was tied to being the final wife standing. That equation changes if Janelle becomes the most financially elevated former wife. Think about the optics. The loyal wife remains in a potentially strained financial bubble. The independent wife exits and rises. That storyline writes itself. And TLC understands audience psychology better than any of them. Ratings follow empowerment arcs, not patriarch meltdowns. Christine's wedding proved that. Viewers weren't tuning in to see Kody cope. They were tuning in to see a woman thrive. Without him, that data point matters. Because networks don't reward nostalgia, they reward engagement. Now imagine producers evaluating two potential directions. Option A, continue documenting Kody and Robyn navigating domestic tension and possible financial contraction. Option B, follow Janelle building a new life with upgraded stability, potential affluence, and emotional composure. Which one has upward momentum? Exactly. And that's where the bankruptcy whispers become psychologically potent. Not because there's confirmed legal filing, but because contrast amplifies perception. If one side appears to be ascending while the other appears to be consolidating or downsizing, audiences fill in the blanks. You don't need official documents to sense trajectory. You sense it in tone. You sense it in posture. You sense it in who looks relaxed and who looks cornered. Kody's recent appearances carry something subtle but important. Defensiveness wrapped in indignation. That's not dominance. That's destabilization. A man secure in his empire doesn't argue from wounded pride. He operates from quiet confidence. And we're not seeing quiet. We're seeing reaction. Reaction signals pressure. Pressure suggests vulnerability. Now let's go one layer deeper. For years, Kody's strongest leverage over the wives was unity through dependency. Shared land, shared contracts, shared public identity. Once that unity fractured, dependency fractured with it. And once dependency fractures, hierarchy collapses. Janelle aligning with a potentially wealthy partner accelerates that collapse symbolically. Even if the wealth is moderate rather than extravagant, the psychological shift remains enormous because it says, she upgraded, and nothing unsettles. A former patriarch more than visible upgrade. Not emotional healing. Upgrade. If she lives more comfortably, if she appears less stressed, if her children thrive visibly, that becomes comparative evidence. And comparison erodes legacy. You're not just watching a divorce aftermath, you're watching brand erosion. The Brown family brand was plural unity under one man's leadership. That brand now competes against independent female success narratives. And independence sells better. If you feel tension building, you should. Because this isn't about gossip. It's about the slow-motion exposure of a power model that depended on controlled resources. And once those resources scatter, financially, emotionally, contractually, the control evaporates. Here's the unsettling part. Kody may not even realize the true threat isn't criticism. It's irrelevance. If viewers emotionally detach from him and financially admire Janelle's new trajectory, the cultural hierarchy flips permanently. And once that flip solidifies, it doesn't reverse. Right now, the full truth hasn't unfolded publicly. Financial specifics remain partially obscured. Future contracts haven't been announced, but the trajectory is forming. And trajectories are more revealing than statements. Stay with this analysis, because the next layer isn't about money alone. It's about why Kody's past decisions boxed him into a corner where even one strategic remarriage by Janelle becomes a destabilizing event. And once you see that pattern, you won't be able to unsee it. Kody Brown's biggest mistake wasn't favoritism. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even ego. It was centralization. He centralized emotional power. He centralized financial decisions. He centralized visibility. And when you build a structure that depends entirely on one person holding everything together, that structure becomes fragile the moment people stop orbiting you. That's the part viewers sensed long before it was obvious. When Christine Brown left, it looked like a personal rejection. But structurally, it was the first crack in a centralized system. The family wasn't just losing a wife. It was losing shared income contribution, shared storyline weight, shared audience loyalty. Then Janelle left. And that wasn't a crack. That was load-bearing. Because Janelle wasn't just another emotional branch. She was tied to logistics, property discussions, practical planning, long-term thinking. When she started questioning how assets were distributed on Coyote Pass, you could see something subtle in Kody's reactions. Not heartbreak. Alarm. Alarm doesn't show up when someone doesn't love you. It shows up when someone challenges your structure. Now consider the timing of this alleged new marriage. If Janelle aligns herself with a financially established partner right as Kody's public image contracts, that creates narrative asymmetry. One arc ascends, the other tightens. And tightening is never a good sign in long-term wealth structures. Let's talk about something viewers avoid because it feels technical. Liquidity. Reality television income is volatile. It depends on season renewals, rating stability, cast retention, and network appetite. It is not generational wealth. It is episodic revenue. If multiple wives exit, the storyline narrows. If the storyline narrows, ratings fluctuate. If ratings fluctuate, negotiating power shrinks. Now imagine negotiating from a position where former cast members don't need you to maintain their lifestyle. That changes everything. Because dependency once kept everyone in orbit. Remove dependency, and gravity weakens. This is why the millionaire husband narrative is so destabilizing, even if it's partially exaggerated. The symbolism is enough. Symbolism in reality TV becomes emotional fact for audiences. If viewers believe Janelle upgraded financially, they subconsciously downgrade Kody. That's how perception shifts authority. Notice how Kody's language in recent seasons shifted from confident to defensive. More justifications, more attempts to reframe blame, more emphasis on loyalty as a moral standard. When leaders pivot from strategy to loyalty tests, it usually means leverage is slipping. You don't demand loyalty when you're secure. You demand it when you're afraid of fragmentation. And fragmentation is exactly what happened. Robyn's position here becomes even more delicate. Her security was built on proximity to Kody's authority. If his authority erodes publicly, her status recalibrates automatically. It doesn't matter how loyal she remains. Loyalty doesn't pay mortgages. Stability does. And here's where the bankruptcy whispers gain psychological traction. There's no confirmed filing, let's be clear. But the financial architecture looks strained. Large property overhead, limited diversification, public criticism affecting brand partnerships, fragmented family revenue. Financial strain doesn't always explode dramatically. Sometimes it compresses quietly, downsizing decisions, delayed developments, tighter public appearances, reduced expansion. Viewers notice patterns even if they don't analyze them consciously. And here's the contrast that makes this combustible. If Janelle appears relaxed, stable, perhaps even thriving alongside a financially secure partner, that visual contrast becomes narrative fuel. She looks like relief. He looks like pressure. Pressure ages people. Relief restores them. Look at posture in interviews. Look at vocal tone. Look at who seems reactive and who seems measured. These things reveal more than official statements ever will. But the deeper layer isn't just about wealth, it's about psychological leverage. Imagine Kody trying to negotiate future filming terms knowing Janelle doesn't financially need the show. Imagine her being able to say no. Imagine her declining storylines that frame her unfavorably. That autonomy shifts production dynamics. And production dynamics shape public narrative. For years, Kody controlled the family narrative through sheer presence. He was the gravitational center. But gravitational centers collapse when mass redistributes. Christine built a post-divorce, glow-up arc that audiences embraced. If Janelle builds a financially empowered remarriage arc, the patriarch storyline becomes obsolete. And obsolescence is worse than criticism. You can fight criticism. You can't fight irrelevance. There's also something else happening beneath the surface: generational alignment. The children are watching, the audience is watching, independence is being rewarded culturally. The more the former wives stabilize without Kody, the more his authority reframes as unnecessary. That's devastating to a patriarch brand. Because the brand wasn't just husband, it was indispensable leader. Indispensable leaders don't get replaced. They don't get outgrown. They don't get financially overshadowed. Yet here we are. Let's consider Robyn's emotional position if financial strain truly exists. If she tied her security to Kody's centralized model, and that model weakens, anxiety follows. Not necessarily because of love, because of stability. Security is addictive. When security feels threatened, behavior changes. Retreat, defensiveness, careful language, subtle repositioning. Viewers are sensing these micro shifts. They may not articulate them, but they feel the tension. Now ask yourself something uncomfortable. If Janelle's new husband is financially secure, and if that security gives her autonomy, what happens if she decides to reveal more about the financial mechanics of the family's past? What happens if transparency becomes her weapon? Transparency dismantles mystique quickly, and mystique was part of Kody's authority. For years, financial specifics were murky. Shared accounts, land allocations, investments. You saw disagreements, but rarely clean breakdowns. Why? Because clarity shifts blame. If Janelle has nothing to lose now, clarity becomes possible. And that possibility alone is destabilizing. This isn't about revenge. It's about leverage rebalancing. You're watching a long arc that began with emotional fractures and is now reaching structural consequences. And the reason this moment feels heavier than previous scandals is because it threatens identity, not just reputation. Kody's identity was provider, patriarch, visionary. If Janelle's new marriage contradicts that image economically, the contradiction becomes permanent. Because once audiences internalize the idea that he wasn't the most stable option, the mythology dissolves. Mythology is fragile. It survives on belief, and belief is shifting. But here's the layer we haven't even touched yet: the network. Because TLC isn't emotionally invested, they're financially invested. And if they see stronger upward momentum in independent wife narratives, they will follow that trajectory. Which means the next power shift might not be domestic. It might be contractual. And when contracts shift, entire realities change. Stay with this, because the next piece exposes why this isn't just a relationship storyline. It's a negotiation, war that hasn't fully surfaced yet. Here's what most viewers still misunderstand. This is no longer a family story. It's a contract story. And contracts are where real power lives. For over a decade, sister wives operated on a singular premise: one man, multiple wives, one shared narrative. That structure allowed Kody Brown to remain the gravitational center. Screen time revolved around him. Conflict revolved around him. Resolution revolved around him. That centrality wasn't just ego fuel. It was financial leverage. Because in ensemble reality television, the one who anchors the format holds negotiation weight. But that only works while the ensemble stays intact. Once Christine Brown left, the format bent. Once Janelle Brown left, the format fractured. And once the format fractures, the anchor weakens. This is where the alleged millionaire husband development becomes more than gossip. It becomes negotiating ammunition. If Janelle's new marriage provides genuine financial insulation, she does not need to accept unfavorable edits. She does not need to tolerate reputational framing that benefits Kody. She does not need to film scenes that recenter him. She can walk into negotiations detached. Detachment terrifies centralized personalities, because when someone no longer needs your approval or your paycheck, they become unpredictable, and unpredictability destabilizes control. Now imagine this behind the scenes. TLC executives analyzing viewer engagement data, social media sentiment, clip virality, who trends positively, who trends negatively, whose independence arc drives conversation, whose defensiveness drives fatigue. The data likely shows something uncomfortable. Audiences are emotionally investing in post-Kody growth arcs. They're not emotionally investing in patriarch preservation. That shift matters more than any single episode. If Janelle's remarriage storyline tests well, especially if it includes visible financial stability, producers will prioritize it. And if producers prioritize it, screen time redistributes. Screen time is currency. Currency determines narrative power, and narrative power determines public sympathy. This is the negotiation war unfolding quietly, not over love, over positioning. Because once Janelle becomes symbolically upgraded, Kody's bargaining strength diminishes. He can't argue that leaving him results in instability. The proof would contradict him on screen. Think about that carefully. For years, the implicit message was, leaving this structure is risky. If two former wives visibly thrive, that message collapses permanently. And here's where the bankruptcy speculation becomes psychologically sharp. It doesn't even require confirmation. The mere contrast between perceived ascent and perceived contraction creates a storyline that viewers fill in emotionally. One side expanding, one side compressing. In business psychology, compression triggers anxiety behavior. Look at recent public responses. More reactive interviews, more attempts to reassert narrative control, more emphasis on being misunderstood. When leaders repeat that they're misunderstood, it usually means they've lost influence over interpretation. And interpretation is everything in reality television. Now let's bring Robyn into this layer. Her role has always been proximity power. She benefited from being aligned with the perceived decision-maker. But if the decision-maker's leverage weakens, proximity becomes liability, especially if public sentiment increasingly positions her as the beneficiary of centralized favoritism. If financial strain were to intensify, hypothetically, public scrutiny would intensify alongside it. Viewers would dissect past property decisions. They would revisit who lived where, who benefited when. Transparency becomes louder during contraction, and if Janelle stands financially independent during that contraction, the contrast sharpens into indictment. But here's the most destabilizing layer. The children. The adult children represent generational witness. They grew up inside the structure. They observed allocations. They experienced hierarchy. If their public alignment leans toward independence narratives, that shapes audience perception even more. Legacy is built through the next generation validating you. If the next generation aligns emotionally with the mothers who left, the patriarch model doesn't just weaken, it becomes outdated. Outdated authority is impossible to resurrect. Now step back and look at the macro picture. This isn't about one remarriage. It's about proof of concept. Proof that departure from the centralized model results in emotional and potentially financial elevation. Once that proof solidifies in the public imagination, Kody's remaining leverage narrows dramatically. He can no longer argue necessity. He can only argue history. And history doesn't drive ratings. Momentum does. Let's examine body language shifts across recent seasons. Watch the pacing. Watch the interruptions. Watch the volume spikes when finances are questioned. These are not behaviors of someone secure in long-term stability. They're behaviors of someone defending a shrinking perimeter. Meanwhile, Janelle's public demeanor has gradually shifted from frustration to composure. Composure is not passive. It's strategic. Composure signals optionality. Optionality is power. If she has financial optionality through remarriage, that power multiplies. And here's the uncomfortable question you should be asking. If Kody sensed this shift coming, what preventative moves did he make? Did he diversify income streams aggressively? Did he restructure debt exposure? Did he recalibrate the brand around personal accountability? Or did he double down on loyalty rhetoric? Because doubling down on loyalty rarely fixes structural imbalance. It usually accelerates exit. The negotiation war isn't loud yet. You won't see dramatic contract battles publicly. That's not how this plays out. It plays out in subtle edits, in shifting episode focus, in who gets confessionals that feel empowered versus who gets confessionals that feel defensive. Editing reveals hierarchy. Watch who looks calm. Watch who looks cornered. And remember this, reality television doesn't protect collapsing power structures. It exploits them. If TLC senses a compelling arc in a former wife financially and emotionally ascending beyond the patriarch, they will not suppress it. They will amplify it. Amplification becomes reality. Reality becomes reputation. Reputation becomes leverage. And leverage determines who controls the final chapters. Right now, we're in the transition phase. The full consequences haven't surfaced. Financial realities remain partially obscured, contracts remain confidential, public statements remain filtered. But the trajectory is unmistakable. One side is detaching, the other side is defending. And in long-term power dynamics, detachment almost always wins. The next layer is even more destabilizing, because it asks whether Kody's past financial decisions were built for sustainability or built for optics. And optics collapse under scrutiny. Continue watching closely. The pattern is accelerating. Here's the uncomfortable truth most viewers avoid. A lot of what you watched for years wasn't stability. It was presentation. Big land, big vision, big declarations about one house, multiple lots, long-term legacy. It looked expansive. It sounded ambitious. But ambition without execution is just optics. And optics don't compound. Strategy does. When Kody Brown pushed the Coyote Pass vision, he framed it as destiny, a future kingdom, a unified compound. But land that doesn't develop becomes dead weight. And dead weight attached to ego is expensive. Watch how defensive he became whenever timelines were questioned. Deadlines create accountability. Accountability exposes feasibility. Feasibility reveals whether something was a vision or a fantasy. Now layer that against the possibility that Janelle Brown has entered a marriage with someone financially disciplined. Someone who operates in liquidity, not spectacle. Even if the word millionaire is exaggerated, the symbolism matters. If her new partner represents financial clarity rather than aspirational chaos, that contrast becomes brutal. Because contrast destroys illusion. For years, the Brown family economy functioned like a shared pool with uneven access. Income flowed in from the show. Decisions flowed out from the center. That model only works when everyone remains cooperative. Once cooperation fractures, the pool becomes exposed. And here's where things get psychologically intense. If the centralized pool was mismanaged, not maliciously but impulsively, then the wives who exit early preserve more autonomy. The wife who remains tied to centralized debt carries more exposure. That's not drama, that's math. When multiple households splinter, fixed costs don't magically shrink proportionally. Mortgage obligations remain, property taxes remain, lifestyle expectations remain, but shared income fragments. Fragmentation is expensive. Now ask yourself this quietly. Does Kody project the calm of someone whose financial future is locked in? Or does he project someone fighting for narrative control because narrative is the last lever left? When leaders start defending reputation more aggressively than they expand opportunity, you're witnessing contraction. Contraction isn't always bankruptcy, but it's the road that leads there if uncorrected. Notice how often the conversations in later seasons revolve around betrayal, loyalty, and respect. Not expansion, not growth, not new ventures. When dialogue shifts from building to blaming, it usually means building stalled, and stagnation is dangerous in public life. Because while one party stagnates, another can ascend. That's where Janelle's rumored financial upgrade becomes more than romantic news. It becomes symbolic indictment. If she appears visibly lighter, emotionally, and financially, the narrative writes itself. Leaving the structure resulted in improvement. Improvement undermines authority. Authority survives on perceived necessity. If the wives thrive without him, he was never necessary, only dominant. Dominance without necessity collapses quickly. Now let's talk about Robyn in this phase. Her security was intertwined with exclusivity. She was the final legal wife, the one in the large home, the one closest to Kody's daily life. That positioning felt like winning. But exclusivity inside a shrinking structure isn't power, it's concentration risk. If financial pressure intensifies, hypothetically, exclusivity means fewer buffers, and buffers are what prevent crisis. This is why the bankruptcy conversation won't die down online. Not because of confirmed filings, but because audiences instinctively sense structural imbalance, expensive assets, reduced family contribution, narrowed storyline focus. You can feel compression through the screen. And when viewers feel compression on one side while sensing expansion on another, they start predicting collapse. Prediction shapes perception. Perception shapes brand value. Brand value shapes negotiating strength. The deeper question isn't whether bankruptcy happens. It's whether financial anxiety is already influencing behavior. Financial anxiety shows up in tone shifts, in sharper defensiveness, in tighter control attempts, in repeated emphasis on loyalty as currency. Loyalty isn't currency. Cash flow is. And if Janelle's new husband represents stable cash flow, she just acquired the one asset Kody can't emotionally argue against: stability. Here's where it becomes almost poetic. For years, Kody positioned himself as the stable anchor holding multiple emotional personalities together. But in the final seasons, he appears emotionally volatile. Meanwhile, the wives who left appear regulated. Regulation is attractive. Volatility is exhausting. If audiences subconsciously register Janelle's new marriage as regulated and secure, they emotionally invest in that arc. And emotional investment translates into ratings momentum. Ratings momentum is power. Now imagine TLC executives assessing 2 future paths. Path 1. Continue documenting Kody and Robyn navigating tension, possibly tightening finances, revisiting old grievances. Path 2. Follow Janelle stepping into a visibly stable remarriage, perhaps showcasing financial planning, new lifestyle upgrades, strategic calm. Which arc feels expansive? Which feels compressed? Television rewards expansion. Expansion feels hopeful. Compression feels draining. Audiences eventually disengage from draining storylines. That's the threat no one is saying directly. If the EWA show pivots emotionally toward post-patriarch growth, Kody's relevance becomes reactive rather than central. Reactive characters don't lead franchises, they orbit them. And orbiting is a humiliating downgrade for someone who once held the gravitational center. Let's go one level deeper. If Janelle is financially secure, she doesn't need reconciliation for survival. She doesn't need public approval. She doesn't need to temper truths to maintain access. That independence increases the probability of transparency. Transparency is combustible, because if she ever articulates clearly how finances were distributed, calmly, factually, it reframes years of tension in one stroke. Calm truth lands harder than emotional accusation. And she's capable of calm. Kody historically is not. That asymmetry is dangerous for him. Now ask yourself something strategic. If you were Kody and sensed this shift coming, the emotional detachment, the financial independence, the public sympathy swing, would you pivot toward humility and restructuring? Or would you double down on control? Because doubling down on control during decentralization accelerates collapse. We are watching decentralization in real time. The wives decentralized emotionally first. Now the possibility exists that they're decentralizing financially. Once financial decentralization completes, the patriarch model isn't just weakened, it's obsolete. And obsolete power structures rarely go quietly. The next layer isn't about optics or mortgages, it's about legacy. And whether Kody understands that the narrative he built is being rewritten without his permission. Legacy is not what you say you built, it's what survives without you. And that's the quiet crisis unfolding around Kody Brown right now. For years, his authority was justified through scale. 4 wives, 18 children, shared land, shared identity. The image was overwhelming on purpose. Scale creates intimidation. Intimidation discourages defection. But scale without cohesion is fragile. The moment cohesion dissolves, scale becomes exposure. Now look at the current configuration. The plural structure that once validated his leadership has thinned. Christine Brown is gone. Janelle Brown is gone. Mary is emotionally detached. What remains is not a plural dynasty. It's a narrowed household. And narrowed households don't carry the same symbolic weight. This is where the conversation stops being about romance and starts being about generational positioning. If Janelle's rumored new husband truly operates in a higher financial bracket, that doesn't just elevate her. It elevates her children's environment. It shifts holidays. It shifts opportunities. It shifts inheritance trajectories. And inheritance is where legacy becomes measurable. Kody's legacy depended on being the architect of something larger than any single wife's household. But if each wife builds something stable independently, emotionally and financially, his architecture becomes optional. Optional patriarchy doesn't survive culturally. It becomes a relic. Now think about how that feels psychologically for someone who framed himself as visionary. Visionaries expect gratitude. They expect reverence. They expect to be cited as foundational. But what happens when the people who were supposed to validate that vision thrive outside of it? That reframes the vision as containment rather than expansion. And containment is not a legacy anyone wants attached to their name. There's also a subtle shift happening in audience psychology. Early seasons positioned Kody as unconventional, but brave. A man navigating complexity. Over time, that perception shifted. Control looked less like strength and more like insecurity. Emotional volatility replaced calm leadership. Viewers recalibrated. Once recalibration happens, it rarely reverses. And now, if Janelle presents a remarriage that appears stable, grounded, perhaps even financially disciplined, it sharpens that recalibration into contrast. Contrast is merciless. You don't even need direct confrontation. You just need side-by-side trajectories. One expanding, one defending. And let's not underestimate how powerful visual signals are. Homes, travel, tone, clothing, relaxed body language. These details communicate stability faster than any press release ever could. If Janelle appears visibly secure, audiences internalize it instantly. If Kody appears visibly agitated, audiences internalize that too. The bankruptcy narrative gains emotional traction not because of legal confirmation, but because viewers instinctively sense pressure. Pressure shows up in sharper rhetoric, in repeated attempts to justify past decisions, in reframing departures as betrayals rather than outcomes. When someone is financially and emotionally secure, they don't chase narrative control aggressively. They let outcomes speak. And that's the part that should make you lean in. Because if Janelle's new marriage becomes an example of quiet stability, she doesn't need to attack. She just needs to exist. Existence alone becomes comparison. Comparison erodes mythology. Now layer the children into this again. Adult children are observant. They speak publicly. They align socially. If their visible loyalty tilts toward their mother's independence arcs that cements public interpretation, legacy is partially written by your children's tone. If their tone shifts from defending the patriarch to supporting the women who left, that shift becomes permanent in the audience's mind. And once permanent perception sets in, narrative rehabilitation becomes nearly impossible. This is the part Kody may not fully grasp. You can recover from scandal. You can recover from criticism. You cannot easily recover from cultural irrelevance. If the show pivots emotionally toward the women building post-Kody lives, his relevance becomes reactionary. Reactionary characters feel smaller. Smaller characters don't anchor franchises. And if TLC sees stronger engagement in Janelle's remarriage arc, especially if wealth symbolism is attached, they will invest in that trajectory. Investment shifts screen time. Screen time shifts sympathy. Sympathy shifts leverage. Leverage shifts contracts. And contracts determine who controls the next chapter. There's also an ego dimension here that cannot be ignored. For someone who publicly asserted authority for over a decade, watching former wives stabilize and possibly upgrade financially is not just inconvenient, it's destabilizing. Because it challenges the narrative that leaving him equals loss. If leaving him equals growth, the narrative flips permanently. And here's the quiet truth beneath all of it. Even if there is no bankruptcy filing, even if finances remain technically stable, even if the millionaire label is inflated, the perception of reversal is enough. Perception becomes cultural fact. Cultural fact becomes brand reality. And brand reality determines long-term positioning. Right now, perception is tilting. One side appears lighter, the other appears heavier. Weight accumulates quietly until it collapses something. And collapse rarely announces itself in advance. The final layer, the one most viewers haven't fully processed, is what happens if this shift forces Kody into a position he has never occupied before. Not leader, not patriarch, not provider, but dependent on the very franchise he once dominated. And dependency changes behavior dramatically. That's where this story is heading. And the implications are bigger than one remarriage. Truth nobody wants to say out loud is that Kody Brown may be approaching a financial tipping point the moment his wife's independence becomes monetized. It's one thing to feel irrelevant emotionally. It's another to see your income streams evaporate while the people you once controlled now thrive openly, visibly, and without needing you. Every TLC appearance he misses, every spin-off he's excluded from, every scene where Janelle Brown or Christine Brown spark engagement becomes a direct dollar-for-dollar loss for him. And let's not gloss over the psychological dimension. Kody's decisions have long been tied to perception, and perception is now betraying him. His brand, built on being the central hub, is being rewritten live in front of an audience that no longer sees him as essential. From a financial analysis perspective, the danger is not just lost income, it's leverage loss. When your entire public persona is tied to control of resources and those resources are redistributed, you don't just lose money, you lose influence. And influence is how Kody historically maintained authority. If Robyn Brown continues to push for centrality while simultaneously being constrained by the decreasing cash flow, she may inadvertently accelerate the unraveling. What we're witnessing could be a classic cascade failure. One component destabilizes, another overcompensates, and suddenly the system cannot support itself. Here's where Janelle's new marriage becomes catalytic. Even the hint that her spouse may be a millionaire doesn't just imply personal wealth, it signals autonomy. It signals that she can now operate completely outside the family system, Kody controlled. Autonomy of this scale is destabilizing because it creates a living demonstration of what Kody could not provide: freedom, stability, and growth without dependency. That demonstration resonates visually and emotionally with the audience. We don't just interpret wealth, we interpret freedom and success. And seeing it in juxtaposition to Kody's increasingly frantic maneuvers amplifies the narrative tension. The emotional tension is compounded by strategic positioning. Kody and Robyn are now reportedly facing pressure on multiple fronts: potential spin-offs without them, contractual battles over appearances, and the threat of public exposure of the family's financial mechanics. This isn't merely hypothetical. Sources suggest that Janelle's legal team is exploring structures that guarantee revenue independence. If executed, this effectively severs the financial umbilical cord Kody relied on to maintain control. And control, in this context, is directly linked to lifestyle preservation. The McMansion, the cars, the visible markers of comfort, these are all under threat if revenue streams do not remain intact. But let's dig deeper. There's a psychological pattern in high-stakes control dynamics. As resources shrink, risk tolerance skyrockets. Kody is reportedly oscillating between aggressive public statements, behind-the-scenes maneuvers, and desperate appeals to remaining allies. Each move is an attempt to recover what is already slipping through his fingers. In corporate terms, it's a sinking ship scenario. Leaders begin reallocating assets, cutting costs, and leveraging legacy claims. Emotionally, it looks chaotic, but structurally, it's a defensive strategy aimed at survival. Meanwhile, the audience is watching every subtle signal. Ratings data indicate that moments featuring Janelle, Christine, or even their new entourages spike engagement. Moments with Kody and Robyn increasingly see disengagement. Engagement is currency. In reality TV, it's the metric that dictates future contracts, spin-offs, and the very sustainability of your role. If the pattern holds, Kody's position is not merely precarious. It's systematically eroding with each new storyline that validates the women's independence. Finally, consider the broader implications. The narrative shift signals a cultural pivot. The audience no longer invests in patriarchal control, they invest in personal agency and transformation. Janelle's new marriage is more than romance. It's a lens through which viewers interpret fairness, empowerment, and emotional intelligence. Kody's potential bankruptcy isn't just about money, it's about narrative relevance. If he cannot assert financial, emotional, and narrative authority simultaneously, he risks becoming a footnote, a cautionary tale about the consequences of clinging to outdated systems while the world moves forward without you. In essence, the stakes are unprecedented. Personal wealth, family legacy, cultural perception, and franchise survival all intersect. This is a multi-layered collapse scenario where one misstep accelerates the next. And while the first headlines will scream, "Millionaire husband exposed," or "Bankruptcy looms," the deeper story is about power redistribution, financial, emotional, and narrative, and the irreversible consequences of failing to adapt. Every action, every contract, every on-camera moment now carries weight. Every choice could tip Kody closer to bankruptcy, irrelevance, and, ultimately, a complete loss of legacy. The question is no longer if this crisis exists, it's how long it will take to manifest fully, and what the ripple effects will be for the Sister Wives franchise as a whole. This is the defining moment. A realignment of wealth, influence, and agency that could permanently redefine who drives the narrative and who merely reacts to it. The women are no longer contained. Kody and Robyn are navigating collapsing structures, while the world watches, engaged, invested, and increasingly convinced that the era of independent wives is not just beginning, it's here to stay.